Hello everyone. Today I'm going to do a Severance Season 1 deep dive to get you all caught up for whenever Season 2 is finished airing. We should have the full story very soon, so please expect a part 2. Trigger warning for suicidal thoughts or actions, abuse, brainwashing, and cults. Continue at your own risk, and yes, I wish I could say the actual words. This feels like a mockery, however I have to say them in such a way to avoid YouTube throwing my video in a void no one can find. Severance is about the concept of having your memory severed locationally. Your work self would be an entirely different human being than the you when you leave work. The you who has lived a life, has a childhood, family, etc. And of course, all of the philosophical questions behind it, while also leaving the mystery of why the company they work for is requiring the severance procedure. Which, before we start the deep dive, let me get all philosophical on the idea real quick, since it doesn't outright spoil anything in the series. First off, for this discussion, we all have to agree the work selves and the outer selves are different humans. Memories are what create us, for better or worse. How we grew up shaped us. And yes, I believe people can change for the better, but it's as intrinsic as how you hold yourself, how you comb your hair, as a character states it later in the season. Imagine being dumped into the world with none of that. The line of where their memories lie is hazy. They can practically function as adults, but having no access to the internet or books really besides the companies. They can remember the idea of bodybuilders, but not how the contests are run. Like in one scene where they were arguing over how a bodybuilder gets paid. Now, I am not comparing this whole discussion to it, but in this case, it seems they run from what I know of the rules of DID and alters. We've heard a lot of TikTok press over this disorder over the past couple years. However, the facts of this disorder are: alters are their own people or animals, etc. It varies, but they have a identity. And if an alter is created, split, fused, etc. as an adult with little to no memories, they can function as an adult. Like cook meals, write, and speak. But they wouldn't understand things like a wrestling payment system. They would speak and write completely differently than the host, however. That is what we see throughout the whole show. You can hear Mark's voice shift from work to home self like a switch. However, to be fair, this could be referring to his work self's naivete and zest for life, versus his outer self's scruffy detachment, a roughness to his voice. This is where the similarities die, however, because the main issue the show presents is: do we have the right of our own volition to create a consciousness just to imprison, who will never get to have a life of its own, worried we can kill it at any time we want? The answer would be obviously no when phrased in such a manner, but that's not how it's phrased to our main characters. It's phrased as: do you want to have a part of yourself who completely forgets your home life for a bit, and you never have to consciously work again? That would be tempting for anyone. Can we really fault them? Especially when they had the procedure, they had relatively no information that Lumen, the company they work for, was weird or had ill intent. For all they knew, it needed so much confidentiality because they were saving the world. And we, as humans, often don't want to think about all the bad things happening outside of our purview. Of course, I'm referencing the bigger things, like war, etc., happening all around us. But even smaller things closer to this, like sending your kid to school, not expecting him to be relentlessly bullied. And even then, the kid can tell you. The work and outer selves can't communicate. There's also 50 other moral questions we can pose about your body not being yours for 8 hours a day. But for now, let's move on to the deep dive. We mainly follow the INI personalities, or the work selves. We see a woman lying on a conference table, obviously confused. We hear a masculine voice coming from a radio. He asks her to take a 5-question survey, assuring her it will make her feel better. She refuses to answer, trying all of the doors, running around, obviously presumably kidnapped. The first question is, who are you? She doesn't know. The second question is, in which U.S. state or territory were you born? She does not know. The third is, name any U.S. state or territory. She states Delaware like it's one of those things graved into your skulls as kids. Count the numbers, sing the alphabet, etc. Fourth is, what is Mr. Egan's favorite breakfast? She does not know. Fifth and final question that breaks the camel's back, what is the color of your mother's eyes? Her tough facade breaks as she realizes she does not know. She has no memories. She's screaming, asking what did they do to her, as a man unlocks the door and says, You got a perfect score. Our main character, Mark, drives to work and sobs in the car before going in. We have no clue why. He goes into work, changes out his shoes and watch in front of the security guard, and heads into the elevator, which is our most used personality checkpoint. His work self notices Petey is missing. We can assume by the way he's acting, Petey was a close friend, if not best friend, to any Mark. The architecture is off-putting. Long white hallways, green carpet. There's 4 desks in a roundabout fashion in the middle of a huge room. All of the technology is from when computers were first invented. These are plastered in random numbers with 5 boxes at the bottom. We meet 2 of our 4 main cast, a middle-aged man named Dylan who is very opinionated, and a counter opposite of an old man named Irving who is making annoying jokes and very by the book. Milchek, who is a security guy's pseudo-handler, interrupts their work to bring Mark to the boss's office. Milchek plugs in a speaker/radio-looking thing like seen in the opening scene. Miss Cobell, we learn is the boss's name, says the board will be joining us, presumably through the speaker. It's eerily dead silent for a few seconds before Mark takes the hint and states, obviously he will sub for Petey as he's done it before. Apparently for this 4-person department, there needs to be a manager among the 4, a higher-up security, a higher-up boss, and the godlike board that still hasn't chimed in. She simply states Petey is no longer with this company, and anything further would be assault on his privacy. Milchek follows with an empathetic tone. I'm sorry, Mark. You guys were one of my favorite office friendships. He is officially the manager, and she says, a handshake is available upon request. Imagine living in that world where there is no such thing as freely given affection. I assume it's just an otherworldly take on professionalism. This entire world, as you see, gives the innies things we in real life deem as a given, as a high-class reward you have to earn. All he will get for being the manager is that coveted handshake and a head statue I'll talk about later. He accepts, and we see the man who initiated the woman on the table was in fact Mark. He has to read from a booklet with pre-written responses to all her answers. I did not preface, but the questionnaire went egregiously. Now we understand he had just lost his friend. Apparently, he even skipped a huge section. The door she was banging on trying to escape actually led to them. Now he's humanized. He's not the perpetrator, he's a victim too. Mark opens the door before he's supposed to and talks to her outright. She worries she was grown in a lab, but he calms her nerves by talking to her as an equal and giving her name, Helly. He wants her to sit down and reopens the book. She immediately goes back to the defensive. For all she knows, she just lost the only human who can save her, going back to a book-reading robot. She hits him on the head with the speaker, trying to knock him out of it. He just takes it, blood gushing out of his forehead as if he wanted to do the same thing in her position. In fact, he did worse. He threatened to kill it, but as we learn, that was Petey. He outright says she needs to ask to be let out again, since, as we learned from Mark's point of view, she only said the specific phrase twice. In the rules, if she says it 3 times, they will let her out. And as a man of his word, he walks her to the hallway, staying back behind a corner to avoid seeing anything beyond the door. Against company policy, I'd suppose. She walks out, having thought she won, just to then turn into her out.I self. We see Milchek, who is behind the door, kindly greeting out.I Helly. He tells her the innie is just disoriented. This is all going to plan, so just walk herself back in. We see innie Helly get frustrated and run out the door. This happens a few times until she eventually gives up, realizing her outer self is trapping her here. Mark gets in trouble with the main boss for doing so poorly, and during the aggressive talking to, she says, "Hell is just a product of morbid human imagination. The bad news is, whatever humans can imagine, they can create." Which, looking at it from an atheist standpoint, is obviously a true statement. However, who is she referring to with this threat? Is she saying Helly is in a hell of her own making? Or slyly commenting that Lumen itself is a hell of a morbid human's imagination? Or neither, and simply threatening Mark with a hell she will create if he keeps messing up. As you will see later in the video, she is, I'd say, abusive to Mark like he's her child. She mainly only has contact with Mark, and practically every other time she is yelling at him, getting physical, or manipulating him in one way. A later scene, me and my mother laughed out loud over how textbook she was being, not even trying to hide it. It was the exact phrases you'd see in Are You Being Abused pamphlets. But it makes perfect logical sense. It does go beyond that, but please bear with me for this point. All this company wants so far is complete and utter control of a human for 8 hours a day. Abuse is a control tactic to keep people in line. If someone is scared, they won't try to investigate further. And our main severed crew have absolutely no defense against it. It's like in the Barbie movie, where all the Barbies had no defenses against misogyny because they genuinely never experienced or heard of it before. In Mark's case, he seems to be content thinking this is just the way bosses are. We then see Milchek show Helly a video of her out.I fully consenting to getting the procedure and being here, which makes Helly realize this is going to be much harder than simply walking out of a door. She needs to play nice until she can formulate a plan. Mark explains to her how they stagger exits so the out.Is don't see each other, which is a small detail, but it fills out how organized this thing is. That's the main reason why I and a lot of others love this show, because every conversation, every snippet we get makes you feel more and more worried about the characters, and adds to the realism of how this operation could still be running. This gives way for Helly to ask, "So I have no choice." And Mark swiftly responds, "Well, every time you find yourself here, you chose to come back." It cuts to end-of-day Mark going home when he walks up to his car and sees a card on his windshield. It says he fell, and gives him a gift card for a local restaurant. Which is absurd. We haven't really talked about it, but someone you do not know is just taking care of your body a third of the day. Yes, in Mark's case scenario, it wasn't that serious. They just threw him a gift card to avoid a lawsuit. But we really don't think about how much we mess ourselves up on an average workday. That we would have no control or memory of it in this world. As he drives off, he almost runs over Helly's Audi, and she comments, "Hey, maybe keep your eyes on the icy road." We get to see Helly's very privileged and poor behavior right out the gate. I've seen people theorize this is why her innie has so much fight, because her Audi seems the equivalent of a Karen and a not-so-good person. That's why her innie felt so deserving of freedom. She wouldn't give up and fight tooth and nail for it. Which of course is good, that's just the only way I can phrase it for now without spoiling further points. When Mark gets home, he's almost aggressively talking to a woman named Mrs. Selvig on the phone about trash bin placement, when his sister knocks on the door. She practically forces him to come to a dinner party. In the car, we get confirmation of why he seemed so depressed, and why he was sobbing in the car. The sister mentions an anniversary of her death. Of course, this is telling the audience his wife died, which humanizes the out.Is more. Again, can you fault a grieving man for wanting to escape, even in a different part of his brain? In the dinner scene, we see sister's husband's friends, and I'm really interested to know if you guys have an opinion on them. Like I said, most details are meant to beef out the world building, so to speak. His friends are extremely pretentious and out of touch, to say the least. They're sitting down for a no-food dinner, which is apparently used for greater communication. However, is this simply an odd group to further the husband, a minor character's profile, or is it a comment on the public of this world? By the end of the show, we aren't necessarily shown different. Mark and the sister are freaked out, making fun of him for the book he writes. It is made of pure pretension and oddness, presumably. It is made fun of by other unaffiliated characters I'll mention. However, he is obviously selling his book of pure pretension and oddness presumably a lot. They're not rich by any means, but they live in a very nice house, and I can't find/remember if the sister has a job, so please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. While researching, I found the perfect word: faux intellectuals. It's exactly how they act. They then learn Mark is severed, and then do that thing where you know everyone in a room is making fun of you, but not outright saying anything, so you can't defend yourself. However, he does defend it, saying there's no other him, it's just him, and that he's not trapping the other self, which, as we know, is wrong, but a great show of his opinion on the matter. Mark and his sister have a bonding moment after the dinner, saying sorry for them all finding out. It's obvious the sister is like Mark in what we'd call normal. He cannot sleep, so we look out the glass to see a man we do not know creepily staring back. He goes to the restaurant on the gift card he got from his forehead. He is in a very heated conversation with the same woman, Mrs. Selvig, about the trash cans. She must be important. The show is making it a point to be disturbed at how much he's taking his anger out on her. He even almost threatens her before stopping himself. The man we saw in the woods sits in the seat across from him and introduces himself as Petey, and says, In there, I'm your best friend, you're my very good friend. Which is a hilarious statement, like he just met this man saying, I don't like you that much. That is the end of episode 1, a precursor to the feeling and world building. I'll only state vital things we learned from here on out. Mark has the duty of cleaning the office every week, which he uses to hide the photos, including Petey. Irv is especially mad since it's against protocol. We also learn innies have a reward system. They have to earn basic office supplies. In a get-to-know-you game for Helly, we are aware of an older woman who retired, where she had a retirement party and everyone knew it was coming. Hence, why Petey's leaving felt more like a death. Milchek uses this to further ground Mark, saying at Lumen things like death don't happen. Hence, he should be grateful, really doing their best to make the innies feel gracious in their prison cells. After having a nice conversation with Mark, Helly sort of freaks out, writing on a sticky note, I don't want to work here, and runs to the elevator. Mark chases her in a fashion she gets terrified of, which makes her run faster. Red lights go blaring as a higher security guy than Milchek runs to figure out what's happening. Apparently, the elevators have code detectors, meaning you cannot escape with any writing of any kind. We switch to out.I Mark, who is on a date, which ends up rather irrelevant besides showcasing Mark is still stuck on his wife. They then see protesters who are anti-Severance. They are kids, late teens max, and Mark tears them a new one, yelling at them to the point the woman he was on a date with leaves him. At home, we finally see Miss Selvig, the woman he was yelling at, and it's the main boss lady, Mrs. Cobell. She is pretending to be a nice old lady who gives him cookies. All we gather from the conversation is how low-functioning he is since his wife died. He calls in sick the next day to go meet Petey. During their restaurant excursion, he gave him a meetup spot, which we see is a greenhouse he's been living in. We cut to the other three innies gossiping on how Mark isn't there when Irving has a hallucination of black paint, which we've seen a few times under his fingernails. It's consuming the world around him. He gets in trouble with Milchek for apparently sleeping at his desk during the hallucination, while Helly and Dylan just converse on how no one knows why their job is sorting random numbers or what it's for. Very quickly cut to out.I Mark talking to Pete. Petey plays a recording and it's Mark's voice saying he is sorry. And sorry is all he can be, begging, pleading, his voice is shaking. It's almost as if he's being tortured. Anyone would be horrified if they heard a recording of themselves under duress like that and have no memory of it. Mark, however, still has the cult-like hooks dug in, so he barely is unnerved. Irving mentions he was worried about going to the break room, which he said with more reverence than you would if it was a timeout of sorts, which is all we've been made to believe so far. Before I explain what that is, we meet a new character called Bert, a similarly aged old man Irving has an immediate connection with. Friendly or not, we do not know yet. In the wellness session, there is a therapist-type woman sitting in an eerie room. Irving sits down as she lists off things about his out.I. Your out.I loves... ... She says different things as Irving is enraptured by this information. He loses himself and giggles at one. She says, please enjoy each fact equally, insinuating he's being tested and there's a failure point. I didn't mention, but before Dylan said the numbers will be scary or elicit emotion. That's how they categorize them. Helly swore he was full of it, but at this point she gets her first scary number. out.I Mark lets Petey live with him, saying his inner self would probably be mad if he let Petey sleep in the greenhouse. Petey goes for a shower and gets extremely sick, seeing his inner self in the shower while he's staring at the mirror, like he has two selves going full speed at once. He coughs into the sink and we see blood. Episode 3, Petey is asking Mark questions and we find out very vital information. Mark lives in a huge neighborhood, rows and rows of nice houses. Through Petey's questioning, we find out it's Lumen's subsidized housing. However, it never quote-unquote filled up, so it's only him and his neighbor, Mrs. Selvig. Which, first of all, if there are staggering exits, there's no way they'd allow severed employees to live close to each other. So the second, or rather main question, is how or why did they pay for a huge residential district to watch Mark a little bit more closely? Because, as I may have not mentioned yet, Miss Selvig / Mrs. Cobell is not severed, so her sole purpose of living close to him is to watch him. Petey is telling Mark how he feels like he is in and out of work at the same time and can't tell memory from present. But the most important thing we get out of this convo is that Petey, seemingly alone, because this plot point is never brought up again, found a department where presumably severed people never go home. They are trapped, and unless it's voluntary somehow, maybe even kidnapped. And like always, Mark's so brainwashed and doesn't immediately go, whoa, what, and quit. Cut to work cells. Helly sent in a resignation request. Apparently the innies through proper forms can't ask their outies to quit. We can see the hope on her face when she is almost immediately rejected and runs to the bathroom. We also see Mark's brother dropping off his new book on Mark's doorstep. Keep that in mind for later. Keep that in mind as well, as I did not catch that on my first 2 watch-throughs and was very confused later. Back to work, Mark. He tries to ask Kelly what's wrong through the bathroom door. Apparently, she's been in there for 40 minutes, and she's screaming for him to leave her alone. He bursts in to see Helly has written "Let me out" across both of her arms, hoping it would get past the code detectors. Mark tells her to wash it off, otherwise Grainer, the higher security guy, will wash it off with the bad soap. What that means, I have no clue. They can't physically hurt the innies to an extent due to it possibly raising suspicion from the outies, so it couldn't have been chemical burns. I think he's just referring to roughly scrubbing, but even then the outie might notice, so who knows. Irving, listening in, suggests taking her to the perpetuity wing, which, as we find out, is a kind of Lumen museum with a bit of indoctrination. Mark goes to ask permission from Miss Cobell. Apparently we need to fill out a form prior, so she rejects him. However, during this interaction, Mark slips up about being upset over Petey, and this is the textbook abuse I mentioned earlier. She says, dead-faced, not even looking up, in a calm tone, "Do you want me to throw my mug at you?" He's standing about to walk out, too confused to speak. Abuse, in my opinion, is a different class of terrifying when you don't understand the 0 to 100. Victims often learn patterns of what to avoid, etc. as a survival technique. If you see their face turn red, you can run. But no, she stuns him into being immobile. And she does throw the mug. She hits the wall behind him and says, "What I just did was something I knew you could handle and grow from. It was very painful for me. I hope you will let it help you." She proceeds to do the fakest cry I've ever seen. Man just said he's sad because his best friend practically died, and she not only hurts him over it, but turns it on him and makes him feel bad for hurting her. Textbook. After the arm incident, Helly writes, "I don't want to work here" on a sticky note, puts it in a pen cap, and tapes it all together, hoping to eat it like a pill so her outie can find it. Mark shows up again and says the code detectors will not only find it, but one of the security guys will have to reach in and grab it. So she'd better tell them which end to start from. Which begs the question, is the code detector a freaking MRI machine or whatever the proper scanner would be? Because if I'm not mistaken, most of those cause small amounts of radiation, which is fine in your yearly checkup, but deadly for the doctors who do it multiple times a day, hence why they start it from a separate room. Are our characters getting a radiation dose twice a day? Is this our first plot hole, or is it just a testament to how crummy Lumen is, that in the long run they don't even care about the outies' health? Mark decides to break protocol and take Helly anyway to the museum. We see Irving fully believes in Lumen's principles and admires its history. Meanwhile, Dylan made everyone but Irving a bingo. Mark seems to not believe in it, but I think he took this trip to just take her for a walk, hoping she'd calm down. I feel the innie's aversion to Lumen can best be ranked as Helly, Mark, Dylan, Irv. Mark does not feel right about its practices. Petey also probably showed him some of the worser aspects. But he's given up on leaving or finding out the mystery. He probably tried just as much, if not more, than Helly at the beginning, due to him even knowing there is a bad soap or the security guy will reach inside of you to take it out. So he has even more of a reason to be subdued. Helly will never learn the lesson because she hasn't had the physical hand down her throat. Another reason why she has the most consistent fight the whole series. Now that he sees Helly's determination, he wants to use his knowledge to help her break the rules. During that portion, I think the only thing that kept him going was the feeling that he wasn't alone. I think he wanted Helly to get that feeling from the museum, that there are hundreds of other severed people that have been through what she's going through and couldn't leave. That would also be a deterrent to most people. I mean, hundreds have tried just as hard as you and failed. We get some more Lumen lore. They've been talking about principles and the tempers, which are the emotions we sort the numbers into. They are woe, frolic, dread, malice, which I know frolic seems out of place, so I researched it. They just mean playful happiness. It's the happy emotion out of all of them. Irving gets mad over the bingo, which causes enough of a distraction for Helly to run. She makes it through a door and is quickly caught. This time Mark couldn't save her and she is taken to the break room. It is a dark room with a bright projection of words in front of her on a interrogation-like table. Mr. Milchek instructs her to say a long phrase highlighting at, "I'm thankful to be caught, all I can be is sorry, and sorry is all I am." Very textbook brainwashing. She has to say it over and over until Milchek decides she really means it. The episode ends with Mark fighting Petey at a gas station after he ran away, being hauled into an ambulance, as if he's very intoxicated. We zoom in as he sees Mark and drops to the floor cold, dead. Episode 4 starts with Helly disheveled, having been in the break room for hours. Milchek gets up. He says we will try again in the morning as Helly gets a little bit of life back in her, practically beaming from the state she was before. She walks into the elevator and immediately wakes up coming out of the elevator, like she forgot there is no home to go back to. She looks at Milchek and just says, "Fuck me." She goes back at it, extremely distraught. We now hear a muffled man screaming in the background. This takes her over the edge, asking Milchek who he is. We see he is monitoring heart rate to tell if she is telling the truth. So we, the audience, realize this is obviously not making things better. Mark finds the brother-in-law's book, I think from context Miss Cobell stole it from his doorstep, and placed it in the severed floor to test if it brought up any memories for Mark. They do so many tiny things I probably haven't mentioned just to simply test if the innies can recognize anything from their outside life. Helly walks out of break room when Mark asks, "How many?" 1,072. Irving and Bert, the man he met in the wellness earlier, talk and hold hands. Helly has a massive breakdown and threatens to cut her fingers off if she can't film a resignation video for her outie, in which Helly's outie threatens her back with keeping Helly in there as long as she can. We see outie Mark at Petey's funeral with Miss Cobell, or rather Miss Selvig. Miss Cobell takes out Petey's severance strip while we find out he had a daughter who is a band member. Remember that for later. And Mark's outie cries for Petey like some of it's leaking through. Irving has a talk with his crush as Dylan finds Brother's book. Miss Cobell tells Mark's outie to have a wellness session where he just sculpts a tree, none the wiser. That's it for part 1. I'm sorry to cut it short, but this is already way longer than I anticipated. The script is actually 7 pages long, normally just being around 2. So have a good day, and I can't wait to see you for the next one. Like, subscribe, comment, whatever you want to do. Goodbye!